Hey, geographers. Welcome to your first video of the new year and the first video of this new unit. I'm going to try to make it quick for you guys because we want to make it back before the fourth quarter of the Bills Broncos game. That's important, right? So I know I wanted to have this up yesterday. My daughter was in the ER most of the day. I sort of warned you that might happen. It just took much longer. But don't worry because I have this info for you now. So this unit is about one that I enjoy learning and teaching about with my political, my government academic background. So hopefully that passion will get to excite you guys a little bit. This is all about political geography. So, when you think of what we've learned so far, it sort of makes sense how geography would affect maybe the materials or how people or where people build their homes or what they eat. But how does their geography affect their politics, their government? This one is not as straightforward. There's a lot of history involved here, but we'll go through it. I think a lot of this is just going to be about what makes a nation or a country, and how does borders and geography relate. All right, so political geography. Here we go. So if you think of a world map, right, and you think what is on that world map, you probably think of independent states, right? You probably wouldn't think of a world map broken down by cities or counties. Maybe you'll think of it broken up by continents, but often you'll see it something like this. This is 10 years old. It's fairly recent. Um, Not completely accurate today, but pretty close. There's a bunch of independent states. We're going to memorize each and every one. All right, that's not true. Okay, but what are the characteristics of what makes these independent states an independent state? So, political geography is the study of the political organization of the world. So, if you were to look at this map from 100 years before that last map, right, it looked very different, right? Now, of course, the land may have changed because of natural disasters or war, but the land is roughly the same. So, why is it that now the maps are so different, right? Why are the independent states so different? So, we're going to learn about the formation of the modern state. So, states the way they look today, um, the processes that shape contemporary political geography. So, what makes a state now that a few hundred years ago may not have been a contributing factor. We want to learn about concepts of political power, what makes it that a nation has power or that it doesn't have power, and their territory, different forms of state governments. So, what is the difference between a democratic republic and a theocracy, right? Uh, Devolutionary factors of a state. Devolution, this is a popular term if you guys studied government already. Think of like in our country, if you think of devolution, it's the federal government returning powers to the states, right? So how is devolution in some states, being reduced to more localized regions? What are the challenges to state sovereignty? We see this a lot on the news today, whether it's Russia challenging the sovereignty of Ukraine, um, President Trump challenging the sovereignty of Denmark to Greenland, things like that. Consequences of centrifugal and centripetal forces. We learned about these forces when we did culture. I know you guys mentioned it the other day when we talked about words you do know from the vocab, so that was good. But how do they relate to politics? I think you'll find that pretty cut and dry. So we want to know the definition of a modern state, and everyone may have it vary a little bit, but there's five main characteristics. So to help us is the main cast of Modern Family. All right, so we know they have lots of extended family and friends, but if you take the central family here, and the five of them, they each will possess a characteristic for us. So thank you, Modern Family, for playing along. All right, so first, spatial extent. A modern state has to have space, right? Like it has to have a place where it exists. It can't just be like in your mind or something like that. It has to have a permanent population, right? It's not a population that goes to Florida every winter, right? Or it's not nomadic where it's only there for part of the time and comes back. So a population that has to be there 24/7, basically. It needs to have defined borders, right? You can be like, well, this is sort of the, like no, this is where you exist. These are the lines, right? That is a definition, that is a characteristic. A sovereign government, right? So it can't be controlled by another government. So like we'll be talking about this issue with Greenland in the news. Greenland itself is not sovereign because it is a territory of um, Denmark, right? So what does that have to do with everything, right? Um, and recognition from other states. So other states, maybe not 100%, but other states have to recognize you as a sovereign government as well. You can't just say you're sovereign. Other states would be like, yo, yeah, you're sovereign. Now, you might say the UN could be a factor that recognizes you. The UN, it can be like a factor here is being recognized from other states. All right, so if you possess those five things, you are a modern state. Now, there's a lot of different types of modern states, a lot of different types of politics it can have. We'll get into some of those as we introduce these ideas today. Now, modern states over time has changed. Okay, so the idea of what was a modern state 100 years ago is different than than it is now. And in fact, the concept of a modern state didn't even exist just a few hundred years ago. So earlier in our history, and we're talking about really all of the world, specifically Europe, but not just Europe, this does apply to other continents, political borders were not as well defined. Instead, political power was basically you had a leader and a group. And think of a king or a feudal lord. Other parts of the world had similar, right? You learned about feudal areas in Asia as well, right? In world history. So here you go. So you have, like, think of a king or a lord, and people are loyal to them, and they will fight for them, and they want them to keep power. And sometimes borders change; they're not always consistent. Um, so the borders are unclear in that time. They were poorly defined, and they changed often. So I'm giving you an example here of Alsace-Lorraine. So in this map, this is between 1555 and 1871. So Alsace-Lorraine is between France and Germany. So France's eastern border, Germany's western border. And if you look, you see over that time, the border has shifted several times in a few hundred years. In that area, you do see a lot of both French and Germanic culture. Some people, or many people, are multilingual. You see how some of the cultures mix, but also some people do identify more as being French or of German. Now, stops in 1871. 1871, you have a German empire, right? It's not the Germany that we think of as Germany today. And there's a lot of history there I won't get into unless you ask. All right, but it's still changed. By 1919, some of that area was returned to France with the Treaty of Versailles. Remember that ended World War I. Then you have 1940. What was Germany doing? Right, creeping back and controlled some of that land for itself again. Then World War II ends. They're like, nope, got to give that back to France. So look, you see many, many times, you see a shift of this border. Right now, over time, we have this concept of a modern state that we do today, that it has like these defined borders. It is not just a leader, it is this group of people. And if you think of the Enlightenment, that's when the ideas of a modern state really came about. So go back even a little bit earlier. I'm sure you all learned about Niccolo Machiavelli when you studied the Renaissance. And he wrote a lot about city states, but even that city state started having the core ideas of what it was to be a modern state. And then you go a little bit into the future, into the Enlightenment, and a lot of other philosophers that you learned about contributed to that idea. You learned about Hobbes, you learned about Locke, you learned about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Okay? Now you have this very big period of classical German thinkers, classical German philosophers, who really advanced these ideas of what a modern state was. It's not a coincidence because the borders of this German empire to these various German states with Bismarck and all these people, with the borders changing, it made sense that this was something that they researched and wrote about. So these people, I'm going to tell you now, I highly doubt you'll have an AP question about these people. Even if you were to take an intro level political science class in college, you might not even get them. But if you take if you take like classes because you do want to become a poli sci major, then you might learn more about them. But we have Georg Hegel, and he started writing about this idea of when you have a nation state with this group of people, things become more practical and rational, and it allows people to reach their full potential. Remember, that was a big part of the Renaissance, people trying to reach their full potential. This is years after. This is, the 1700s, but still. You have Max, and that's Georg down there. You have Max Weber. This is a quote of his: human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of force within a given territory. To him, that's what makes a modern state. So, in other words, if you can control, he writes a lot about violence. If you can control that the only physical force used in this country is by your country, then you're a modern state. It's not other states coming in and exerting force in your country. That's like the TLDR version, right? Then you have Hegel. You're moving to the 1800s with these guys, and complete freedom of particular members with their well-being. So to him, modern state, it's similar to Hegel's because it focuses on people's well-being. So think of when you learned about Adam Smith and the four main functions of government, right? And how those would help, promote people reaching their full potential, right? That Enlightenment economist. Now you might say, but some modern states don't really promote freedom. You can be communist, let's say, and be a nation state. And some, Karl Marx read a lot of this, right? So I don't want you to get down into nitty gritty. The big takeaway is knowing that the change of what a nation state is has changed over time to what it is now. All right, that the idea of what we now consider a nation state or a modern state didn't even exist, a few hundred years ago. All right, borders play a factor in this as well. So, in the modern state concept, people have allegiance to the state and the people, and there are borders that are drawn to formalize divisions these countries. It's not like, well, I think that this is here. I think no, like there is a formal border. There is a fence between you and your neighbor, and you have a spotlight that goes on if they get too close to that fence. Maybe you're one of those people, right? Now, Europe imported divisions on areas as they colonized them. So now, since these countries in Europe are like, well, these borders are important. As they colonize, we'll learn about the scramble to Africa. You learned about that in world history. They also were imposing borders on these colonized area, which we learned sometimes was really bad because sometimes they were putting borders where they were like breaking up nations of people or combining ones that didn't get along. I do want to emphasize that Europe wasn't the only area that colonized. We see imperialism that happened in Japan, for example, but this was sort of like where we see this happening first, I guess, is the first one to sort of set up these other borders. Here are some things to keep in mind. When we had our revolution, when we declared independence, and you were to draw a world map, at the time, what we would consider a modern state, there was only 35 of them in the whole world. All right. By World War II, there's only 70. Okay. Now we learned about decolonization and countries getting independence in like the 18 teens, 1820s in South America. But you have that happening a lot more after World War II, right? A lot of these empires are now collapsing and a lot of sovereign states getting their independence. How many independent, modern states do you think there are now post World War II? All right. Well, you think also there's only about 91. And then you have more, no, I haven't checked that number, but it's not, it's more than 70. Then you have the Cold War. And when the Cold War happens, think of the USSR breaking up into, the Ukraine and Georgia and Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia, right? You have parts of Eastern Europe breaking up more into more sovereign states. So you have a lot more. So by the United States now considers 195 autonomous modern states. Okay, the United Nations is a little bit different. As of January, so as of this month, the UN looks at 197. 197 plus two observant member states. So ones that aren't considered official or sovereign um, modern states, but um, Palestine and Vatican City. So, which ones does the US and the UN not agree on? We can find that. I can't remember off the top of my head. I can think of one, but I can't think of all of them. But it's pretty darn close. So just know that the number of the idea of modern states is growing as more people, more sovereign nations look to exist. Okay, now this might seem overwhelming because there's a lots of different types of modern states now. Okay, you can just be a state, you can just be a nation, you could be a nation state, you could be a multinational state, you could be a stateless nation, you can have a semi-autonomous region, you can have an autonomous region. Right? Don't be overwhelmed. Once you get the basic definitions, just by looking at multinational, okay, more than one nation, you'll be able to figure, like, you'll remember. So after we review this a couple of times, if you don't get it right away, you'll get it soon. So this is something I stole online: the difference between a state and a nation, and it's I would change things a little bit, but it was good enough that I thought, okay, we can use this. Someone pointed out in class, and they were right, that like we have 50 states. What we view as states isn't really the official definition of a state. A state is basically what the average person would think of as a country. Decades ago, there was like an Aussie hair product commercial, and it was about, like, it mentioned something about state, and they're like, "Oh, but Australia isn't a state." And me being like a child was already like, "No, but Australia is a state. It's just not the way we use the word state in America." Right? Nerd power. All right. So a state, think of as a country, think of as a modern state, right? Our US states are within the state of the United States, right? I know that's tricky. So what is a nation? All right. A nation is a group of people that have a shared similar culture. They have a historical attachment to where they live or where they want to live, to their homeland, and they seek political control of that land. Now, a state and a nation can be one and the same. It also might not be. Okay, so this is where we'll see when does it match up or not. If you are a nation state, right, your borders match up to those ideas. Your nation's borders are those that are the same as a state's borders. Your people are linked through a common culture and a common history. You may be small, you may be isolated. You're often small and you're often isolated. So think of Japan, right? Isolated. People there have a common history, a common culture, and their political borders are the same. Iceland is a European example. Now, here's the controversy. An AP classroom I noticed did not mention which one is the United States. All right. Most political scientists would argue that the United States is a nation state. You might be saying, like, well, it's not small, and there's a lot of different culture. A nation state can be multicultural, right? I think for the purpose of not making your brains hurt too much, whenever the AP will propose examples to you, they'll probably think of more homogeneous culture and not multicultural nations. But a nation state can be large and it can be multicultural. Because even though we have many different nations, many different cultures in the United States, there is still a common culture. English is still a predominant language, even if it's not spoken by 100% of the population, and things like that. So I don't want that to be, too confusing to you. So next, we're going to go to a stateless nation. So that is a group of people that do not have their own political state. They're probably spread out over several different states. The national group is usually the minority group in each state. There can be exceptions, but usually it's the minority group in each state. And they usually have little to no political power in each. That doesn't mean they don't have any political power, but this is just what's trending, right? So for an example, this map here is Kurdistan. And you notice that Kurdistan does not have its own state, its own modern state, but it does have a nation. It's a nation of people, and they exist over what's now several states. So not too long ago, we mentioned about the prime minister of Kurdistan complaining about a new rule in Iraq that allowed girls as young as 9 to be married. So, wanting their political voice to still be heard where, some of their people, where some of their nation exist. Palestine, another very newsworthy current uh, area that we should talk about with this unit. That would be an example as well. All right, now we have multinational states. So think of this, a state with more than one nation in it. So even though the United States is a multicultural state, it's still homogeneous in that it's sort of like all one, right? But there are several nation groups in a multinational state. One group tends to be dominant. Not always, but tends to be. So an example is the UK. And every year I have to go over this with students. Like, what's the difference between Britain and England and the UK, right? So you have the British Isles, like all these areas. The UK, the United Kingdom, is that political modern state, which includes Wales, England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. That's a whole other issue we'll get into with this unit with Ireland and Northern Ireland, right? Now, to the average American, you might not think that there's a big difference between someone who's Welsh or Scottish or English, but there's still movements for Scottish independence, all right? That still exists. It is still one state, but it consists of different nations, all right? Canada would exist that way too, because you have French states and British states in Canada. You have a lot of First Nation states in Canada. Russia would be another example. Not everyone in Russia speaks Russian. A lot of people don't even realize that, right? So those are some examples. This is the last slide. See, this was not so bad. Autonomous and semi-autonomous regions. So these are both areas that are inside of a state. And when I say inside, it might be an island, so it's technically not inside, but political boundaries it would be. So a semi-autonomous would be, they would have moderate degree of self-government and freedom, right? They still have control of their nation. They have some freedoms, but they still have to play by the game somewhat of what's around them. Hong Kong, right, would be an example of that. The next type would be autonomous. And autonomous regions or autonomous nations have a high degree of self-government and freedom. So you have areas like this in New Zealand, the Cook Islands, for example. But also the United States has autonomous regions in the Native American reservations, as illustrated by all the purple areas here. And what a lot of people don't realize is look at Oklahoma, right above the Texas. Oklahoma, 43% of that state is Native American reservation. And this map, it looks like it's even more. I want to make sure it's not 43% of the population. But either way, it's an overwhelming percentage, as Arizona at 27%. So on these reservations, they still have to play by some rules by the federal government, right? You still can have cases concerning Native Americans go to the Supreme Court, for example. But they may have their own police, right? Own sets of certain rules. Like think of casinos that could be on this property. Why is that, right? Because they have this degree of autonomy. Now you might say, why did we put Canada, that's First Nations, as a multinational state, and then this is autonomous? Are there still some autonomous regions in Canada because of that? Sure. But think of it this way. Like if you were to look at our Congress, we don't have representatives for these Native American reservations. We have our first Native American cabinet member with Deb Haaland as the Secretary of the Interior. That's a good trivia fact for you guys, but it's a different makeup. Okay, so hopefully this was not too tricky. This is just the introduction. We're going to break down a lot of this stuff more, go into more examples. But as we repeat the ideas, and like you said, if you think of what is semi-autonomous, autonomous, what is it? Once you know what the difference is between a nation and a state, you'll understand what is a nation state or what is a multinational state without even explaining it. You'll be able to figure it out with your smart brains of yours. All right, let's get back to that football game, and I'll see you guys Tuesday.